This lecture expands on the concepts reviewed in the demand and supply lecture and the market equilibrium lecture. When you look at demand and supply curves in the future, after reviewing this particular lecture, you're going to see different things than you would just by reviewing the demand and supply lecture and the market equilibrium lecture. You're going to see the concepts of consumer and producer surplus, even if they're not on the chart, and you will understand in a competitive market how that equilibrium point maximizes efficiencies and maximizes resource allocations. In this lecture, we're going to review demand side and supply side market failures. Well, you want to think of market failures as an economist. Market failures exist when the market does not achieve resource efficiencies. We will review the concepts of consumer and producer surplus and explain how properly functioning markets maximize the total surplus while optimally allocating resources. It's going to give you a broader perspective than just a typical demand and supply curve. Market failures do happen in competitive markets. They do. It happens when markets, for various reasons, fail to consume and produce the right amount of the product. In this particular case, resources may be overallocated or they may be underallocated. Two conditions must hold if a competitive market is to produce efficient outcomes as we would view it as economists. First, the demand curves must reflect consumers' full willingness to pay for a good or service. If this condition does not exist, then there is a demand side market failure. In the worst case, some consumers enjoy benefits, why they call it demand side market failures. In this concept of consumers' full willingness to pay for a good or service, some consumers enjoy benefits without paying what they would pay. We're going to see an example of that. And sometimes they get benefits without paying at all. And, one of the examples that we can use here is, fireworks display. You may not pay to get into the event of a fireworks display, but you can sit in your backyard and see it at a distance and enjoy all the fireworks. So you get a benefit without paying at all. But the most important concept on this chart is consumers who enjoy benefits without paying what they would pay. On supply side market failures, this occurs when firm does not pay the full cost of producing its output. The external cost of producing the good are not reflected in the marginal or average total cost. You want to think of air and water contamination may not be reflected in the average total cost of what a firm is doing. Okay, economists would call this a supply side failure because they're receiving a benefit that is not included in their cost. So we have demand-side failures, we have supply-side failures, and we're going to take a look at how those two come together in the next couple of charts. Economists maintain that properly functioning competitive markets achieve economic efficiency. When they are efficient, two conditions must hold. Demand curves must reflect the consumer's full willingness to pay, and the supply curve must reflect all the cost of production. If these conditions hold, then the market will produce only units for which benefits are at least equal to cost. It will also maximize the amount of benefit surpluses that are shared between consumers and producers. So there's two concepts here. I want you to visually think of a demand and supply curve intersecting, and at that point of equilibrium, the benefits equal the cost, and we will see later that the surpluses, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, are maximized and shared by both. We're also going to take a look at a condition where that does not exist, but I want to go through the consumer surplus and the producer surplus first. Let's take a look at these two surpluses. Consumer surplus. The benefit surplus received by consumers in a market is called consumer surplus. It's the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and what the consumer actually pays. Think about buying a new car. If you walk out of the dealership paying $2,000 less than the maximum price you were willing to pay, then you have realized a consumer surplus. Consumers get an extra benefit by paying less than the maximum they were willing to pay. How can we think of maximum price willing to pay? By thinking about the opportunity cost of other purchases. If you pay more than the maximum you are willing, then something else has to be given up because you have a limited budget. If you pay less than the maximum you're willing to pay, you have money left over to get other stuff. You get a benefit. Many consumers do not pay the maximum price willing to pay. They only pay the actual or market equilibrium price. On this chart, we have 6 consumers who purchased the same product. Shown on the first column is the maximum each is willing to pay to purchase the product. Column number 2. Each is willing to pay, right? Ranging from a high of 13 to a low of 8. However, each consumer purchases the product at the market equilibrium price of 8. So you want to think of each walking into a store. This is the maximum price they're willing to pay based upon their own personal budgets and the opportunity cost of being able to purchase other stuff. And they walk into the store, and each one of them will see an actual price of $8. Some consumers will generate a consumer surplus that you can see in column number 4. Every consumer But Betty, shown at the bottom, generates a consumer surplus. In theory, this surplus can be used to purchase other products and services within this constrained budget. Thus, the benefit. This is your classical demand curve, downward sloping. The equilibrium price here is $8. Okay. The yellow rectangle on this chart represents what consumers actually pay, the price times the quantity, P1 and Q1. The collective consumer surplus is represented by the total green area on the graph. The surplus is above the line P1 at the equilibrium price of 8. So these are the 6 people that walked in. They all purchased at 8. That was demand. Quantity at that price. But you recall from the previous table that some of those consumers had a consumer surplus. That's what's represented by the green triangle here. Higher prices would reduce the consumer surplus. Higher prices would also not be at the equilibrium, but higher prices would reduce the consumer surplus. If the equilibrium price is 10, then the consumer surplus would be reduced. Okay, and all you need to do is you need to go back to the previous table and just mentally plug in 10, and you can physically or see that the surplus would be reduced, and you ought to do that on the PowerPoint slides after you complete the lecture, okay? Consumer surplus, people getting a benefit because the price is less than the maximum they were willing to pay. There is also the concept of a producer surplus. The producer surplus is the difference between the actual price a producer receives and the minimum price they would accept to bring the product to market. The extra benefit is what they get from receiving the higher price. The minimum acceptable price equals the marginal cost of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship required to produce the unit. It also assumes that all the costs are included, and there's no free external costs, such as polluting the air and water without paying for it. But it can also be viewed as the opportunity cost of bidding away resources from another project. So here we have market price and the minimum I would accept as a producer to bring that product to market. Because I have to trade off other stuff. I have to trade off opportunity cost to bring that product to market. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at the same kind of table that we looked at for the consumer surplus and now look at the producer surplus. On this chart we have 6 producers. Each producer has a different minimum acceptable price they're willing to sell at. Column 2. From a low of 3 to a high of 8. Depending upon their individual marginal costs, land, labor, capital, etc. All the producers must sell at the competitive price, at the equilibrium price. All generate a producer surplus, but Chad, as his costs must be the highest. The initial producer surplus is shown as the blue triangle up to the line at P1, or the equilibrium price of 8. If the equilibrium price were to increase to 10, then the producer surplus would also increase, and you can find that by going back to the table. I think even at $10, even Chad has a producer surplus. Two surpluses here. Consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now we're going to come back and tie these two concepts together. Here we have the demand curve and the supply curve. We have the equilibrium price. We have a consumer surplus and a producer surplus that is maximized at the equilibrium point of P1 and Q1. We also know that we have efficiencies because the marginal benefits equal the marginal cost. We have previously learned that productive efficiency and allocative efficiency happen at the point of equilibrium, where the demand and supply curves intersect. But the reason that I introduced the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is another way of looking at this efficiency, is to say that the consumer and producer surpluses are maximized. Efficiency occurs because at Q1, consumers are paying no more than their maximum, and producers are providing at a price no less than their minimum. Here is also where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. No more is being consumed, no more is being produced than what yields the maximum benefit. Two things are happening on this chart. In the first series of lectures that we learned on demand and supply, we just learned that this is the equilibrium point. This is the market clearing price. This adds two other layers to this classic demand and supply curve. One is productive and allocative efficiencies at the point of equilibrium. But in this particular sets of charts and tables that we have reviewed, we also introduced the maximum surpluses for both consumers and producers are attained at market equilibrium. If the market is not at equilibrium, not at Q1, assume at quantity Q2, then there is an efficiency loss from underproduction. This area is comprised by D, B, and E. There's an efficiency loss from underproduction. There's also less consumer and producer surplus. If the market operates at Q3, there is also a deadweight loss from overproduction, represented by B, F, G. Conclusion: the equilibrium point maximizes the surplus shared by consumers and producers and allocates resources efficiently. So when you look at demand and supply curves in a competitive market, I want you to now think about the equilibrium, the price clearing point. But I also want you to think about that resources are allocated efficiently. There is no overproduction or underproduction. Resources are not overconsumed or underconsumed. And at that point, at point B, consumer and producer surpluses are maximized. So we've taken the simple concept in this lecture of demand and supply, and we've expanded it and embellished it so you will look at this differently as you move forward.